We now go to Stevenage. Stephen McPartland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to be able to speak in this debate, and I'd also like to send my best wishes to the member for Old Bexley and Sidcup. It's also a great pleasure to see the Minister in his place respond to this debate. I listened very carefully to the Minister, and I really did detect the hint that there could be a compromise, which is what myself and the member for Southampton Itchen have been calling for many months now. We're very keen to work with the government. We're very keen for the government to maybe table an amendment in lieu, accept our amendment today, or if the Minister feels inclined, maybe even move our amendment to a vote to test the will of the House. But I imagine we won't have the opportunity to vote on what's called the McPartland-Smith amendment today, sadly. However, I would like to pick the Minister up a little bit on the point he made around this not being the correct place for the amendment. I believe it is, which I'll come on to in a moment. But I would like to also set on record that myself, the member for Southampton Itchen, those who supported our amendment and the leaseholders themselves are all very clear. We've never asked the government to pay for the full cost of remediation. We've never asked for the taxpayer to bail people out. We just want the taxpayer to provide a safety net for leaseholders to ensure the fire safety works are actually undertaken. It's been nearly 4 years. We want to be in a position whereby the government provides the cash flow up front, and then the government can then levy those who've been responsible within the industry over the next 10 years to recoup those funds. And that's our plan, that's our objective, and we'd love to work with the Minister and the government to actually get this resolved in the Lords. I do say to the Minister today, the Lordships have already agreed to retable the amendment if it's not accepted, and it'll be tabled in the Lords on Friday. And we'll be back to discuss this later on in a few months' time, I'm sure. So I do hope that we can work in the in-between time to actually come to some kind of solution together. Now, I'm very proud to be the chairman of the Regulatory Reform Select Committee, and the Fire Safety Bill does amend the Regulatory Reform Order 2005. The reason why this bill is so important is because it creates a financial obligation on leaseholders to pay freeholders for the cost of remedying any fire safety defects on external walls and doors, such as cladding, but not limited to cladding. So it can include fire safety breaks, a whole variety of other issues. So I assume that this is an unintended consequence. The government doesn't want leaseholders to pay. It was very clear from what the Minister said earlier, but it's not sure how it can actually resolve the problem and get the works fixed without leaseholders actually paying. So from my point of view, we're very keen to ensure that leaseholders are not responsible. And in terms of dealing with this order, we have to amend the Fire Safety Bill because we can't wait for the Building Safety Bill. The Fire Safety Bill creates this legal obligation. It creates the position whereby a fire authority, which is a competent authority, can order a freeholder to do the works. They have 21 days to agree to do the works, provide a timescale, or that's a criminal offence. And once they've had this direction from a competent authority, the leaseholders are then required to refund the freeholder for those works that are done. We already have leaseholders in their thousands up and down the country who are on the verge of bankruptcy. Some have already gone bankrupt, and that's just waiting before they actually get to the costs of this remediation, paying £15,000 a week in blocks of flats for waking watch, a whole excessive insurance premiums. It's huge. So today I urge the government to either accept our amendment, let us vote on our amendment, or work with us to ensure that in the Lords we resolve this issue and leaseholders do not have to pay.
Thank you. We now go to Sheffield. Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, could I send my best wishes to the Right Honourable Member for Old Bexley and Sidcup. When he was Secretary of State, he and I discussed our respective illnesses, and I really feel for him and his family at this very difficult time. The Select Committee has discussed the issue of cladding remediation and fire safety works on many occasions. In June, we made it clear that the residents are in no way to blame for the defects from cladding, and it's our view they should bear none of the costs of remediation. We repeated these sentiments in our pre-elect scrutiny of the Building Safety Bill. Again, we said Government must recommit to the principle that leaseholders should not pay anything towards the cost of remediating historical building safety defects for which they were not responsible. That's very clear. So the question is, who should pay? Either the initial developer, and the government could help coordinate action against them, the taxpayer, of course, or the industry as a whole. Unfortunately, the amendments we're looking at from the Honourable Member for Stevenage, and I very much agreed with the sentiments of his comments just then, or the Labour front bench, seek to place responsibility on the freeholder. For reasons the Minister gave, that these amendments cut across the contractual relationship between freeholder and leaseholder, and the Honourable Member for Thirsk and Moulton, who's raised this issue a number of times in the Select Committee when he was a member, showing that these freeholders are often quite small companies who, where they were not responsible for the initial development, are simply collecting ground rents. And if faced with the costs of remediation, they will simply walk away. These amendments will not get that work done. That's the fundamental issue. We want to see it done without the leaseholders having to pay for it. So, coming to who should pay, certainly the government's put on the table £3.5 million in addition to the £1.6 million, but that work does not include anything other than cladding remediation. All the other works, which for many leaseholders are as substantial in cost as cladding remediation, are not covered. And of course, it doesn't cover buildings below 18 metres. The government's come up with a loan scheme for buildings below 18 metres, but that places the loan charge on the freeholder. Again, surely we're back to the same problems, Minister, that if you can't interfere with the contractual relationship between the freeholder and the leaseholder, as according to you can't with the amendments before us from the opposition and the Honourable Member for Stevenage, then surely that is a problem for the government's loan scheme as well. And if freeholders are going to walk away, as the Honourable Member for Thirsk and Moulton said, from a direct charge on the properties, then they'll walk away from a loan as well. And that's a real problem that the government's got to address. Welcome that the government is going to introduce a levy and a financial contribution from the industry, but we appear to be in the position where the government can't tell us whether the money raised from the levy is going to be in addition to the £3.5 billion, or it's going to be taken from the £3.5 billion. In other words, the Treasury is going to get some of that money back. And that, to my view, would be wrong. The Minister is going to come to the Select Committee on the 8th of March. Hopefully, we're going to be a bit wiser after that visit. Finally, we've talked a lot about leaseholders, Madam Deputy Speaker, but what about social housing tenants? The National Housing Federation say there's £10 billion of remedial work to be done in the social housing sector and more for council housing properties as well. Yet the only automatic right social housing landlords have to any funding is help with the removal of ACM cladding. Everything else they're likely to have to pay for. That's tenants are going to have to pay through rent increases, cuts to future maintenance, or cuts to the house building programme, none of which are acceptable. So you have the very perverse situation where the social housing landlord, as a freeholder, could be ensuring that tenants have to pay for the remediation of properties next door which have been subject to the right to buy. That cannot be right. All these matters need resolving. We hope the Minister does on his visit to the Select Committee.
We now move on to 3 minutes. Royston Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. May I draw members' attention to my entry in the Register of Interest, please? Mr Speaker, I have no axe to grind with the government. They're my friends and colleagues. I like them. I get on with them, but I'm not going to blindly follow them when I can see that the treatment of leaseholders is wrong. Firstly, in tabling our amendment, we have never said that we would ask for taxpayers' money. We made that fundamentally clear right at the beginning, and it's worth repeating that. I know that many of my colleagues would have supported our amendment, but they were told that it would be an open chequebook, and therefore they chose not to. Secondly, our amendment will not wreck this bill. It will make it fair for the innocent leaseholders caught up in this crisis. There are 3 parts to this, Mr Deputy Speaker, in my opinion. There's the moral issue. Who, in good conscience, could leave these people to pay huge insurance premiums, sometimes increased by over 1,000%, huge waking watch charges, and crippling costs of remediation, if we could do something to help? Who would do that? Then there's the economic issue. When you own just 10% of your home, but you are responsible for 100% of the remediation cost, what do we think people are going to do? They will be saddled with tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt, while their home is valued at nothing. Mr Deputy Speaker, this part of the housing market is heading for collapse, and thousands of leaseholders are heading for bankruptcy. This government could and should prevent this from happening. Finally, there is a political dimension. Successive governments have put home ownership at the centre of government policy. They have encouraged people to get on the property ladder. We have incentivised them through schemes such as Help to Buy and shared ownership. Imagine the howls of derision, Mr Deputy Speaker, when the first government minister stands up and claims that we are the party of home ownership. The recent government announcement is very welcome, and I know that many people are grateful. But what sort of solution says we concede it's not your fault, but we're only going to help half of you? So for those buildings over 18 metres, cladding will be removed for free, but not in buildings below that height. Worse than that, Mr Deputy Speaker, those people living in buildings below 18 metres will be saddled with unaffordable debt to pay for cladding remediation. They will, worse, know that their taxes will be paying for their neighbours' remediation.
You will.
I will.
I'm very grateful, and I absolutely understand the spirit behind his amendment. But will he answer the point I made earlier? How will his amendment operate if the building owner walks away? And also, does he accept his amendment will put somebody else on the hook for the costs of remediation, not just for historical defects, but for any defects in the future?
What I will do, Mr Speaker, is I will refer him to the two things he said now. One is he said, we'll carry the can, and now says who's going to be on the hook. It sounds to me like he's very happy for leaseholders to carry the can and be on the hook, but not to find a solution. That's the government's problem, to find the solution. What our problem is to say that leaseholders should never have to pay, and that, Mr Speaker, is not an unreasonable position for us to take. In trying to help, Mr Deputy Speaker, this government has satisfied no one, and it's upset just about everyone. The leaseholders are not responsible for this. They know they're not. We know they're not. The government knows they're not. And therefore, Mr Deputy Speaker, the government's position is now untenable. In conclusion, I will appeal to them and to all my colleagues to think very carefully before they abandon thousands of their constituents. Because I know this, Mr Deputy Speaker, they will not forget and they will not forgive.